International Federation of Journalists. I'm just going to ask you some questions about the delegates meeting next year. It's the 100th anniversary of the lockdown in the trade unions. And I'm just wondering what kind of themes you're going to think will be coming up in Dublin next year.
Well, first of all, we are all very excited to be going to Dublin. The NUJ, which is a founding member of the International Federation of Journalists, had in the past congresses, either in England or in Scotland, but it's the first time we are going to Ireland. It was a very closely fought bid, but at the end of the day, there is a lot of enthusiasm that we're going to be in Ireland, because there is this convergence of all this, different dates. There's the 100th anniversary of the strike. There is also the year where Ireland's going to be at the presidency of the European Union. So we think that not only kind of the National Union of Journalists in Ireland, but also the labour movement and the citizens of Ireland have got a lot to offer for us. It's also, you talked about themes happening at a time when there is a crisis of journalism almost everywhere in the world. And there is, kind of a parallel theme with the situation today in Ireland with the state of journalism and also, the kind of the wider financial crisis. The theme of it is going to be the fight back. It might be a bit ambitious, but we are trying to move away from several years where journalists all over the world try to digest and understand what's going on, which is just, what is going to be the future of journalism, into, trying to set out, specific kind of ways of how they want to go forward. And I think it's going to be, if it is going to be the springboard for a fight back, Dublin is really kind of maybe the most kind of important city for that discussion to take place.
Do you think that students within the industry can get involved in that kind of thing next year to help with the themes that you've just discussed about?
Well, we very much hope so. We are at the moment trying to sort out the logistics. In fact, one of the most important arrangements is to hold the conference and the arrangement for the conference in union organised establishment, and that has never been done in the IFJ before. Of course, it does restrict the choice for accommodation, for places where different events could take place, but nevertheless, it's it's important that it's happening in Dublin, and it's giving kind of maybe giving us a model of what to do in the future. We're also taking steps to ensure that students play part in it, and we hope that when we start making those arrangements, the reporting part of it, at least kind of the internal one that's under our control, we will use students. We'll try to bring them together, and that is again something that the NUJ has done very successfully in the last few conferences, and is still doing it now, but the IFJ has never done. All the reporting, even with social media and new ways of doing it, is always in the hands of professionals. They've got the press corps, who comes and get, registered and go and do the business. But we think that journalists could put completely different flavour. I wouldn't say, innocent or neutral, but coming from the journalists, and many of them, are potential kind of, the journalists of the future. We really kind of think about that very seriously and want them to give them all the support that they need to do it.
Okay, just moving on to the UN agreement that was being set out last month to do with the threat towards journalists. The UN agreement motion was set to help protect journalists within the EU. I'm just wondering how you think it's going to progress over the next 10 years with this movement.
Well, first of all, there is one of the biggest part of the crisis of journalism is safety of journalism, safety and protection of journalists. And the IFJ had for about 15 years doing very rigorous monitoring every year of the number of journalists that are killed, the kind of attacks and the circumstances. And that is very much like, an effort to try to raise awareness and make the whole world know that journalists die when doing their jobs. And our research showed that not all journalists die in a zone of conflict. They don't die in wars, or they're not all kind of very famous journalists. The vast majority of journalists are beat journalists. They die in their own patch. And in some countries, when there are today, a very high number of journalists that die for all kinds of reasons. In Mexico, when they kill a lot of journalists, it's because of the way that they report on is a narco war, is that those type of of events that take place within the Mexican society that the journalists are involved in that may groups of people wants to kill them. We have recorded over 300 journalists dying in Russia. And in Russia, there is a bit of conflict in Chechnya, but that is not where most of them die. Most of them die at the hand of the targeted killings and at the hand of gangsters. Some of them are political killing. So it has become a very major issue. And when doing the monitoring for the last 15 years, we thought when there was some peaks that it was because of the war in Iraq or something else. But then there is now like a steady drip. There is on average about 2 journalists die every week. So the big issue is how to stop that. How to stop that. And we believe that in many places there are enough kind of international instruments to protect journalists, but that many of the governments are not really, they haven't got the will to implement them. Because part also kind of the issue of the killing of journalists is that in most cases there is total impunity. It's very cheap, to shut up a journalist by killing them. You just hire a killer, and they're out of the way. So impunity is also kind of a huge issue, and the international instruments are precisely tools, try to move on the question of impunity. What we did at the United Nations, and we do that also at the other agencies of the United Nations, like UNESCO. UNESCO have got a brief on the protection of journalists. The Human Rights Council in Geneva have also got a brief in terms of, putting together new mechanisms and new legislations, and you can take cases there, to try to force government to do something about them. But there's still the question of there are enough instruments, but they are not implemented properly. So that events at the UN is to put even more pressure on them to do it. And every now and again, we push them to enact new instrument that in most cases we're trying to make them binding, because there are so many levels within kind of the international institution, but there are a lot of resolution and covenant and declaration. Most of them are not binding, even when governments sign them. But there are certain type of legislation that are binding, which means that you can take governments to international courts if they don't implement them. And we're preparing for the next session of the Security Council for another campaign to try to reignite everything that we have been doing on that issue.
Okay, and just lastly, this is coming up to your last time in presidency now for the International Federation of Journalists. Just wondering what your career highlights have been in the time?
Well, it's not my last one. I'm just finishing I'm finishing a cycle, all right? Okay. And there is yet no discussion about what's going to happen in the next cycle. I'm not a full-time person employed by the International Federation of Journalists. In fact, I live in England, and their headquarters is in Belgium, and I travel, the world over, on their behalf. So it has been very hard. It has been very hard, and you have to respond to crisis almost everywhere. So it has an impact on your career. I can't work as a full-time journalist. That is impossible because of all the pressure that are on you, and all the time, you have to deal with the crisis as and when they arise. So you haven't got that choice, between an easy choice between your full-time job and being involved at that level in the International Federation of Journalists, and that's why I'm a freelancer. In fact, I came to this conference from a 2-day trip that I had in Tunisia, where I was there because it was the country that triggered, the Arab Spring, and is still kind of, in some kind of evolution, But journalism and media freedom is still the most important issue. And I went there because there was a journalist in one of their main newspapers who started the hunger strike on the issue of editorial freedom. And that's something very rare here. And many of them are young women journalists that are going on hunger strike, on the issue of press freedom. They're not doing it to have more money. They're not doing it to have a better working condition. Is that on an issue that not many people here would take that kind of drastic action? And of course we have to go there and help them and worry about their welfare, and also to make representation to their government to try to find a way of resolving it. So you get issues like that are not under our control, that blow up almost everywhere. It could be at any time, and I'm very much obliged, to go and deal with it. So the effects on my life and what I do and my family, they're quite difficult, but most of the time I will have to do it.
Are there any events coming up in the next few months that you'd like to discuss that might have an influence on maybe today or anything in the future?
Well, today, of course, I'm here because I'm also on the leadership of the NUJ, and this, in fact, what has been discussed today is not different from what is discussed elsewhere. The crisis of journalism is putting pressure on our unions almost everywhere when they lose members, when they have to readjust, not only readjust their structures on how to work, but even readjust the vision of journalism. Today, in many cases, a big institution, the first question they ask you is, who is a journalist today? Of course, we try to tell them a journalist is a person who makes a living out of journalism, and we are their representative. But they say, yeah, but if you take, for example, protection of sources, when you get, which is a big issue, for many unions, when you get more and more authorities, police, judges, trying to get journalists, either to reveal their sources or to give them material. So when we try to work, which the journalists, resist, and the organization resist, is the media organization or trade union do, but when you get to the level of institution to say, look, can you kind of, implement, legislation, because protection of sources is recognized in many kind of European and international legislation. The first question is, well, yeah, but if you want us to do that, we have to agree who is a journalist. So you start having authorities, trying themselves to determine who and who is not a journalist. So there are all these issues that are very much happening all over the world, but at the moment, the most important issue for us is safety and security of journalists. We're also dealing with journalists in prison. It may not happen here, but in many countries, some of the best journalists, the ones that are really, pushed to sacrifice quite a lot of things in terms of what they're doing because they're journalists. In many places, they're not killed, but they're put in prison. In many places, they push them to flee the country, and they're in exile. So they are, it's very difficult to say where the next thing, because it's not kind of a targeted strategy. We do things that are organized, but we always have to react and to respond to things. That is the biggest part of the way that we fulfill our obligation, to be able to respond to anything that takes place.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. That's Samantha Booth reporting from the Students' Delegate Meeting 2012.